I opened my eyes, and it was still night, and I was still lying on the street. However, the fog now was lit by the radiant indigo light of the vortex. Angelica was no longer holding me in her arms. Instead, standing beside me with an urgent, worried expression was my sister. "Get up!" she yelled as I coughed and tried to stand. "You don't have any time. They will find you in moments. You have to hide." "How do I do that?" I said, stumbling to my feet and beginning to follow her off the street and into a row of trees by the sidewalk. "First, we have to get out of the open." She led me into an empty house, although it was completely furnished and appeared lived in. "We have to find their home computer," she said as her eyes darted from corner to corner before landing on a desk in the dining room on which the PC sat. She grabbed me by the arm and pulled me to the desk, where she shoved me into the chair before the keyboard. "Okay, I need you to turn the computer on and open their web browser." I did as she said, but was utterly baffled by her instructions. "All right, while it's doing that, I want you to project into their wireless network." "Whoa, wait, what? Why?" I asked as she slapped me over the head like she did when I was a kid. "Just do it, okay?" I did as she demanded and watched as the web browser came on and the screen connected. "All right, now, I want you to search the dark sphere." I did as she said, and I watched as the tiny cursor blinked into an hourglass as the engine started. To my amazement, the entire screen of the monitor dissolved into a grid of lines and numbers, and at the center, in its entire three-dimensional holographic glory, was Nico Arata's datasphere. Good job. Now, imagine that you are feeding yourself into the computer and go to the sphere. Get in and get as much data as you can possibly can before you leave, when you will show up exactly as you are now. If I'm not here, then you're going to have to find your own way out by yourself. Just remember, everything is symbolism here. So, if you can imagine something working, then it just might. Also, forget your body and become only perception, and it will be almost impossible for them to find you. Good luck, she said, kissing my cheek. I love you, Clay. Be careful. As she leaned back and glanced at the window, I watched as she suddenly seemed to become static and blurred before I saw a raven fly from the place where she had been standing. Looking back at the screen and taking a deep breath, I exhaled, letting myself be drawn into the system. What followed was a sensation akin to falling, but only for a moment before flight. Taking her advice, I envisioned myself as a bodiless sight flying over the cybergrid as if it were a landscape below me. The purple-blue gleaming glow of Nico's hidden data seemed the size of some neighboring planet as I approached and began a descent towards the buzzing electric surface. The closer I came, the more it seemed as if I was now slowly disintegrating like a meteor burning upon descent through the atmosphere. However, the sensation, far from being unpleasant, was instead a smooth and euphoric release as I once more seemed to assume the role of observer in a series of recorded events. There was a continuing whirl of image and sound as if my mind were working in unison with the sphere to find some appropriate starting point. The effect was dizzying and fantastic, simultaneously as gradually the whirl slowed into an ongoing and steady pattern. As I entered, I forced myself to concentrate and maintain some kind of focus as I was enveloped in the ever-deepening abyss of information which spanned around me like the body of some unexplored new planet. The center of my focus would be two questions. One, how did Neil Kenny become involved? And 2, how did Yamashita develop the method by which they had harnessed the vortex? The answer to the first was found as I neared a particularly dark mass of swirling energy which held the appearance of an atom floating in the stratosphere of the orb. I flew to it and immediately began to sink into a dialogue of data in which, in moments, I was completely immersed. Chapter 16. The recorded datasphere of Nico Arata, as experienced by Clayton Marcells. 2030 of Ghost World Calendar. Dr. Neil Kenny had become one of the most successful plastic surgeons operating in the field. Sought after by the rich and famous for his brilliant reconstructive techniques, he had become a shadow celebrity in his own right. Wealthy beyond the dreams of his other self, he lived a life of decadent luxury in the greater St. Louis area. His home, although positioned almost exactly in the same place as his counterpart, was by no means a modest suburban dwelling. In its stead was an enormous mansion seated in a gated community of doctors, lawyers, and business types. He had been encouraged at the dawn of his burgeoning success to relocate to Los Angeles, where most of his clientele originated. But the Kenny had refused and simply let the stars come to him. His hallmark was secrecy, and his ethic had paid off dramatically. Kenny was a master of the flesh, and his mastery had made him millions. Criticized for his disregard of the actual beneficial aspects of his trade, he continued to indulge the vanity of the famous and ignore the needs of the stricken. It seemed that someone so gifted could help those truly in need, but Kenny's price tag was well beyond any means affordable by anyone not of a higher social class, greed being another one of his central defining qualities. Little was said or known of Kenny in the actual media. His reputation was like that of a particularly good escort service or hitman. If you looked for him, you would find him, but otherwise, he might not even exist. The concept being that when you got the work done, no one would know anything had happened at all. He was a man who knew how to keep secrets, and secrets he most certainly had by the dozen. However, there would come a time when all such mysteries would be revealed, and Neil Kenny's name would finally be known to the public. After investigators began searching through the convoluted web of deceptions and intrigues that had always been Kenny's personal life, a clear red trail of blood would appear that would lead all the way back to his adolescence. While still in his early teens, he had ran away and lived on the streets of Kansas City for several months before finally being rescued by social services and placed in foster care. Kenny would later say that he had been too old to be adopted, and so had been juggled by various foster families until he had emancipated himself at 17. Hidden away in his private files were records which indicated severe disturbances in his psychological development. No reasonable family could tolerate the bizarre behaviors evident in his formative years, behaviors that later he would hide behind a barrage of good looks, good grades, and compounded layers of complex lies. It was often remarked by his colleagues and teachers that it was unbelievable that a young man who had led such a troubled and difficult early life would still manage to persevere in his studies. This success was attributed to a diligence and dedication to rising above his shadowy past, but he would comment later that school and research had come so easily to him that it would have been ridiculous for him not to succeed. He had taken a strong personal satisfaction in coasting through courses that left others shattered and exhausted. Above all else, Kenny had relished his superiority, and school had provided him with a stage on which to flaunt the one thing that he did have that others didn't: a cold, calculating, and meticulous intellect that recorded perceptual information identically. His choice to go into medicine had first bloomed from obsession with surgery that had bordered on fanatical. Kenny was so intensely fascinated by the concept of reworking human tissues that even others entering the same field found his intense regard for the human body disconcerting. His professors were baffled when he pursued a career in plastic surgery, and many considered it a loss to the medical community in general. Later, investigators would find the mysterious deaths of patients at nearly every internship and hospital job that Kenny had ever held. There was a commonly held belief among analysts that it was possible that Kenny had used medicine as a smokescreen for his murders from the very beginning. Kenny had become adept at killing without even the victims knowing that they had been murdered, thereby assuring that the spirits of the victims would not come a-calling at his door. Kenny had managed a feat that few serial killers had succeeded in doing. He had found a means by which to satisfy his sick ego with no repercussions forthcoming. However, as with all such desires, he would come to want more. That was when he discovered ghost light apparitional removal technology, and a whole new world of sadistic evil had opened up. He was no longer content to inject air bubbles, mix medications, and sabotage surgeries. There would be blood and screams and experimental surgeries like none could ever imagine. Nor would there be any intention of the patient ever surviving Dr. Kenny's new surgeries. He would be free to pursue these fantasies without fear of some medium on the police payroll digging up the corpse of his latest conquest. At one point, Kenny told a psychiatrist that he had actually written a full-page letter of gratitude to Yamashita Enterprises and had given the Ghost Light apparitional remover 5 stars on newproduct.com. Kenny would stalk an unsuspecting victim in much the same way as any such predator does, and then through subterfuge and manipulation lure them back to his home. His choice of victims was fairly ambiguous, as was his own sexuality. As a point of reference, his own sexual preferences and inclinations had remained a mystery throughout his interrogations and interviews. It was surmised that the very act of killing and reconstructing the flesh of his victims was a form of sexuality unto itself, and the sex of the victim arbitrary. The clinical nature of the murders astounded investigators, who were left horror-stricken and traumatized by the sights they witnessed in the secret gallery beneath Kenny's home. He had created monstrosities of transfigured flesh with such precision and attention to detail as to seem obsessively professional in the time and effort put forth in his degenerate pastime. Forensic scientists who had worked steadfast in their field for years were horrified by the sight of bodies sewn with extra limbs and flayed wings of joined bone and tendon. Eyes were a particular fascination of Kenny's, and many of his subjects were covered in transplanted orbs in various odd placements about their bodies, both inside and out. The entire front portion of victims' heads were removed and placed upon the abdomen with stretched, gaping mouths, complete with dislocated jaws. Kenny told psychiatrists that he had fantasized about reanimating his creations so that he might see them move and thrash within the new and beautiful forms he had given them. All his atrocities were carried out in the glow of the ghost light, so as to assure the spirits would quickly be exorcised from the vicinity to prevent interference or retribution. He admitted to taking an abhorrent pleasure in seeing the ghosts momentarily view the work he had done before they were dispersed. In the end, Neil Kenny was the source of his own undoing. Over a period of some 20 years, his obsession had gradually deteriorated his inhibitions, and he had lost control of himself during a surgery at a particularly well-known female singer who had approached him for a simple facelift. The damage Kenny wrought upon her features would destroy both her life and career. The nurse and anesthesiologist would later attest that he had been so calm and focused that they had no clear idea of the horror he was committing until he had removed the entire upper half path of flesh from her face, starting at her upper lip. At that moment, they had stood frozen in shock at what they had just witnessed as the red muscle tissue and facial bones and cartilage were exposed completely in one quick movement. Kenny had stood back as if surveying a particularly interesting item on the shelf of a retail store. Then, just as his two assistants began to shake and scream, he chuckled and casually laid the limp sheet of flesh back down like a handkerchief over the wide, lidless eyes staring up at them. Without looking up at them, he turned and walked away from the operating room and quickly left the clinic as panic ensued in the wake of his crime. A worldwide manhunt for the missing plastic surgeon eventually would find him hiding in a Brazilian resort 9 months after police had raided his home and found the grisly gallery sheltered in his basement. After his capture, Kenny confessed in explicit and prideful detail every aspect of his gruesome obsession. Ironically, it would only be after Kenny was shot himself after escaping a psychiatric hospital that executions using ghostlight to disperse the spirits of the criminal would become popular. It was said that these ghostlight executions were inspired by Kenny himself. A bounty was afterwards posted for anyone who might happen to encounter Kenny's spirit or give information leading to its removal. Unfortunately, no substantiated reports ever led to this occurrence. In the time that Kenny spent in custody before his escape, he underwent intense psychiatric evaluation during which the details of his obsessions and professional career finally came to light. It was revealed that the success of Kenny's surgical practice was in large part due to his willingness to perform unorthodox and sometimes illegal cosmetic procedures that otherwise might not have been attainable within the United States. His vivid descriptions of leg lengthening to attain height, rib cage distortions, and skull fracture facial reconstruction proved to be just the tip of a nightmarish iceberg. His records were full of files on patients who had desired unusual and dangerous varieties of physical augmentation, of which he had been only too happy to oblige. Kenny had been in the business of creating human monstrosities, and even more disturbingly, had gathered a following of augmentation enthusiasts whose steadfast loyalty remained even after his demise. It was conjectured that cells of Dr. Distortion followers, numbering in the thousands, were supporting Kenny's vision and work with a fanatically religious fervor. Rumors that Kenny's ghost was being protected amongst these followers filled the internet, and law enforcement could not deny the claims. A computer-hijacked copy of his personal journal was making the rounds amongst these groups, and was known to the public as the Distortion Diaries. Attempts to identify and question members led investigators into an underground subculture of body augmentation and ghost worship, where Dr. Neil Kenny had been elevated to the ranks of divinity. Here, in the backrooms and hidden meetings, ghostlight had become a means of giving the dead greater power and influence. And the concept of spirit dispersion was seen as a blasphemy. Unfortunately, these cults were protected under the right of religious expression, and law enforcement's reach was blocked by the constitutional rights of these groups to practice their constitutionally sanctioned religion. The hunt for Kenny's ghost soon came to an abrupt end, but profilers continued to study his journal in an attempt to understand the process of Kenny's psychopathy. The beginnings of the journals were in-depth documentations of his murders before the advent of ghostlight. They described in detail the thrill of power he had experienced causing the deaths of various people secretly over the formative years of his medical education. Still, he had longed to feel the twisted ecstasy of a more personal experience in private, where he could relish every moment of the torture and the suffering of his victims. He described the initial excitement when he first heard of the removal properties of the ghost-like technology and how immediately he had begun preparations to make his fantasies a grisly and cruel reality. What happened was a step-by-step description of each deformation and murder, with notes on how he had first made contact with the victims and prideful examinations of his stalking techniques. The last entries disturbed even the most seasoned researchers as Kenny's bizarre ideology was explained. Kenny stated that in the last moments of his experimentation, when the victims died and witnessed the grotesque transfigurations he had inflicted on them in the ghost light, the shape and form of the apparitions themselves altered to reflect the physical change. He believed that the appearance of ghosts was linked irrevocably to some self-perception of their form at death. His delight at watching his creations animated in a spectral state was a euphoric and godlike feeling, like none other. Nico checked out of the security station and began the long drive home. It was already dark, and the woods beside the road were laden in thick, heavy shadows as her tired eyes stayed trained on the road, only by a sheer act of will. As the vortex continued to yield more secrets, her workdays grew increasingly longer, and often she found herself leaving in the dark of morning and returning near midnight. Since her father's passing some 6 months previous, she had ceased to exist outside of her research, and in so doing managed to deny all thoughts related to the cold silence which had fallen over her relationship with him before he had died. She had bitterly disappointed him, but she would not allow herself the time to contemplate the emotions that this sad truth evoked in her heart. Why did he have to hold to his foolish ideals to such an extent as to ignore her messages and refuse her contact in his final days? This question in itself was foolishness. She knew why. His close-knit group of bosses had hidden him away according to his last personal wishes. He didn't want her to know where he died because he knew what she might do. In darker moods, she would even envision herself entering a hospital room with a ghost light box cradled in her arms, intent on setting him free. That's what it truly amounted to. At least that was what Yamashita wanted the public to believe. They had the answer to a dilemma which had troubled the world since its creation. However, her father had clung to his paranoid traditions and had joined the ranks of all the other preservists, as they called themselves, those among the living intent on continuing a ridiculous legacy of spiritual preservation of the dead. They held protests, filed lawsuits in desperate attempt to stop the wheels of progress from taking their inevitable turn. Was it not a better world without the sorrowful reminder of the dead wandering around every corner? There were always people who could not let go of the past. And now, they sought to force this pathetic view on those who simply wanted to just move on and forget. Why was it so wrong to want to grieve without the deceased present? To never let the mourning end? She thought of her mother's ghost, distant and dreaming, as it wandered the garden in some state of eternal preoccupation. Was this the afterlife that any one person would wish for themselves? She remembered her father's response to this same question. Perhaps, he had said. It is a very fine day that she is reliving over and over. Maybe a day when there were few worries, or a day when you had come to visit. You think that she is imprisoned, when in fact, that may be the most free any soul will ever get. Is that what you want? To be suspended in some memory, dream, or nightmare, only to occasionally emerge, just to see a glance of time passing beside you? She had been angry and crying as she walked away from him. What if that is all there is? And all we will ever have? He had shouted only so that she would hear him, and there was no anger in his voice. Only that same profound disappointment. She pulled into her driveway and switched off the ignition. She sat in the dark, feeling the air turn cold, watching as the wind blew over the trees and grass in her small yard. What day would she relive if she were to die now? The last time she had felt good, or even remotely happy, had been the night in the bar with the two strangers. Shay and Dee had been kind, interesting, and fun. Nico had been tempted almost every night since to leave work early and see if she might run into them again at some local bar. Instead, she had buried herself in more work. She opened the car door and stepped out into the cold breeze as she closed the car and locked it with a honk that made her jump from her skin. She laughed quietly at herself as she climbed the steps and began punching in the security code at the door. She entered and reached for the light switch, only to find her hand falling on warm, soft skin. She fell back as a large hot grip wrapped around her wrist from the shadows. There was just enough light from the streetlights outside shining through the window for her to make out the bizarrely altered flesh of a long, surgically disfigured hand. The two middle fingers had been sewn together, the flesh ingrown, and the space between the first and third fingers deepened far into the hand past the knuckles, giving the appearance of 3 excessively long and deformed digits. Her impulse was to scream, but she had fought to maintain her self-control as her eyes followed the impossibly long arm to a tall figure that stood before her. As it stepped forward, her resolve melted in panic before the stretched, deathly pale skin of what appeared to be a human scarecrow. It was male, she was certain, but his face had been split open to the bone in a long gash from his lower jaw across his now absent eye and over his forehead, then stitched back together with gleaming steel wire that appeared to run all the way down to the bone, maybe holding the skull together as well. Through some sickening process, the bones of her assailant's body had been stretched, probably through repeated breakage and restructuring during healing, until his stature and shape were nightmarishly spider-like and repulsively thin. In the socket where the man's remaining eye should have been, there was in its stead a large dark sphere of some opaque material which now began to glow with a dim purple light. She realized that this orb was in fact a biomechanical prosthesis, as wires ran from the flesh of his temples and down over his naked, bony shoulder. The light, as it grew in intensity, now brought to mind the indigo radiance of a ghost light. Her will now crumbled, and she began to feel the first wave of hysteria just as the thing's other hand drew forth a small sprayer resembling an asthma inhaler. She thought she saw the scarred and lipless mouth twist into a smile as a purely human male voice with a British accent said, "Just take a deep breath, love, and you'll feel so much better." As he sprayed the device in her face, The mist smelled of heavy ammonia, but the effect was immediate and overwhelming as a warm pulse of sedation and euphoria spread through her body and mind. She fell limp and dangled by her arm in his grasp as he laughed and sprayed the toxin into his own open mouth and inhaled deeply. He dragged her across the floor of the front room and dropped her onto the couch before switching on the touch-activated lamp with one of his long, deformed fingers. She gazed around the room and now realized there were others present in the house. Someone sat at her computer, typing quickly at her keyboard as she heard footsteps and movement from the kitchen. A figure appeared in the doorway, dressed in a hideous white and pink little girl dress, 2 sizes too small for the female figure within. The woman's cleavage hung in the loosely tied front lace, revealing the top half of breasts covered in burns and scars as she bounced into the room in a bizarre mockery of a schoolgirl skip. The woman's long, dirty blonde hair, bound in 2 pigtails, bobbed as she approached and knelt by the couch, clutching an ice cream cone from Nico's refrigerator in her hand. The face which edged into Nico's view was covered in a stained white plastic mask resembling a doll's head, but with an open jaw for the woman's small mouth and 2 violet glowing orbs behind the eye holes. "Oh, she looks tired," said the woman in a sing-song voice as she licked suggestively at the vanilla ice cream. "She can't go to sleep yet. We haven't even had time to play." The woman turned her head to the side in mock sadness as the grotesque man laughed. "Don't worry about it, Abeline," he said as he bent over and ran his long, cold fingers over Nico's thighs. "She's just a little stoned is all. She'll have plenty of pep for game time, I'm sure." He took another blast from the inhaler and blew a draft of mist from his small nostrils as another figure emerged from Nico's bedroom. It was another female, but dressed in ragged sheaths of revealing leather that gave full view to the rippling, vein-covered muscles of her body. Her head was shaved bald and crisscrossed with a network of gleaming metal stitches that pulled the skin of her face so tight as to give a distorted alien visage complete with enormous glowing red eyes. The skin of the woman's cheeks had been surgically cut as to extend her mouth within inches of her multi-pierced pointed ears. Nico could see the woman's complete set of teeth all the way back to her molars, which had been wickedly sharpened to predatory, jagged points. Nico turned her gaze to the computer chair, where all she could see of the 4th invader with long, platinum, straight blonde hair. When the figure turned in the swivel chair to face her, she found her drug-fogged horror turn to fascination at what she saw. The woman's face had been minimalized to an absurd exaggeration of conceptualized beauty. The characteristics implied by the standards of societal attractiveness had been employed to the point of monstrosity. Cheekbones heightened to sharp points, a nose reduced to a tiny bump with pinpoint nostrils, and a chin worn to a vicious triangular edge completed the portrait of some pathetic plastic toy with glowing violet eyes. As she stood, the body within the plain white dress echoed the alterations which had muted her face. High, fake, rounded breasts, impossibly small, frail waist, and legs lengthened like unbending stilts as she approached. She looked down at Nico and spoke in an Eastern European accent from a mouth that was but a tiny pink slit. "Hello, Misorata. We have looked forward to meeting you." Her voice was quiet and robotic. "We require your handprint and security code for the Yamashita research mainframe. We wish to extract every available file on the Vortex, and Ghostlight research. If you cooperate, then we will attempt to make this experience as pleasant as possible. But should you refuse, then we will resort to more invasive measures of extraction. Isn't she pretty, Sabin? Abeline said to the woman in white as she twirled Nico's dark hair between her small, nimble fingers with short, chewed fingernails. I want to play with her, she giggled from the marled, scabby lips visible below the expressionless doll mask. I hope she isn't too cooperative. She's quite a lovely thing, the man said as he licked his mouth with a long, split tongue covered with numerous metal studs. It would be a shame if we didn't get to have some fun with her. That is entirely up to Miss Arata, Griffin, the woman replied in her emotionless monotone. Who are you? Nico whispered as the room became gradually more white and snowy with the effects of the drug. We are your friends, Evelyn said with her girlish, high-pitched voice. And you should just do what we ask so that everything will be nice and comfy for you. Otherwise, things will get very nasty. She laughed and covered her mouth with her hands in a playful shame, like a child saying a swear word. I can't, Nico replied with desperate, pleading eyes. My job, I could lose everything. Oh, you don't seem to understand, love, Griffin said as he leaned over her and nuzzled her cheek like a hungry animal. If you don't work with us, you will lose everything. But, by all means, feel free to refuse. We will be more than happy to give you some incentive. His hand squeezed slightly below her ribs near her breast as his breath, reeking of the chemical spray, fell over her face. She stared into the purple glow of his visual orb and saw the endless, deepening abyss of the vortex. The silent third woman, who most likely was rendered incapable of speech by the massive disfigurement of her mouth, lunged forward. She gripped the male by the neck and lifted him away with awesome strength and shoved him easily to the side. He shouted in protest, calling her Pandora, as she grabbed the front of Nico's blouse and hoisted her effortlessly into the air and slung her over her broad shoulder. As she was carried to the computer desk, she could see the small unit attached surgically to the monstrous woman's back, which seemed to be the power source of her ocular replacements. Nico was dropped into the chair, and her hand placed on the security scanner, which glowed as her print was analyzed. The woman grabbed Nico's hair roughly as her other leather-gloved hand pointed at the keyboard. Code, growled a low reptilian slur from within Pandora's mouth. And only then did Nico notice the small submachine gun lying by the console. Terror coursed through every pore of Nico's body as she hastily entered the access codes for her research files at Yamashita. Immediately, the Yamashita welcome screen disappeared and was replaced by an assortment of icons, all representing different aspects of the current Ghostlight data. She looked up at Pandora's mutilated face, only to be thrown with incredible force to the floor. Sabin took her place at the desk and, inserting a flash drive into the USB slot, began downloading information. Abeline leapt on top of Nico's prostrate form and began running her hands over Nico's trembling body. Very good. Now we can play, she chimed joyously as she removed a long knife from her boot and cut the front of Nico's blouse open. Revulsion and terror filled Nico as she prayed in her mind to die before the wretched things could begin their sick game. Just as Abeline had placed the cold blade beneath the middle strap of her bra, there was a sudden crash from the front of the house. Abeline looked up, and Nico watched as a bullet hole cracked the material of the woman's mask in the center of her forehead, and she rolled dead to the floor. Nico lay frozen and unable to move as more gunshots filled the room. She could see Griffin drawing a pistol from a holster at his belt, but before he could even raise the weapon, was pelted by an onslaught of bullets, tearing through his ribs and throat. The creature, known as Pandora, had taken a stance behind Sabin and was returning fire at the unknown assailants with the Uzi she had snatched from the table. A bullet had torn through the white flesh of her shoulder, but she seemed oblivious to pain as she defended her position. Nico saw Sabin snatch the flash drive from the tower as she made for the kitchen with Pandora shielding her escape. As quickly as the assault began, it was over, and the room seemed remote and silent as Nico lifted herself to her elbow. She almost screamed when hands fell on her arms, but a calming, familiar voice said, "Just hold still, honey," and her eyes fell upon Shay. Nico burst into tears and began weeping hysterically into the woman's comforting arms. "Are you okay?" she asked with soft concern as she held Nico's violently shaking form. Soon, Dee was standing on her other side as he reached forward and placed his hand on her head. She began to fight and crawl away in reflexive panic until she heard his calm and hypnotic voice say, "You are safe now, my kind." Suddenly a warm calm fell over her as the terror subsided, and she looked into the strange goggles which studied her. No, I'm not," she replied. "It's over now. Yamashita will have already discovered the security breach. They'll fire me and have me arrested." "You're coming with us," Shay said with a smile. "We won't let anyone hurt you." Although her rational mind said different, Nico felt comforted by Shay's words and was compelled to believe her by the strange new calm which had blanketed her emotions. What did they want with all that information? Are they going to sell it? "What little we truly understand, we will have to explain later," Dee answered as he helped Shay raise Nico to her feet. "Right now, we must get out of here, and quickly." "Where will we go?" Nico pulled the front of her blouse closed as they walked her through the damaged front doorway towards a black '68 modern Chevrolet Chevelle with detailed purple flames which was parked on the street. "We have a place in Savannah, Georgia where you can hide out, but we need to know some things about Yamashita and the Vortex." Shay was helping Nico into the back seat as Dee scanned the neighborhood for signs of danger, the .38 revolvers he had used in the house now hidden within his coat. After they were safely inside, he slid into the driver's seat and the engine started with a dull roar before the tires spun with a squeal and they sped off down the dark street. The houses at the side of the road became a blur as Dee steadily climbed gears, and in moments they flew out of the city limits like an obsidian rocket, leaving gravity far behind. Dee punched a button on the MP3 player at his side, and suddenly Ava Adora by the Smashing Pumpkins was playing through the speakers. Nika suddenly felt very tired, but she fought to maintain consciousness until she caught Dee spying her in the rearview mirror. He smiled beneath the strange eyewear and said, "It's okay. You can go to sleep. You will only have good dreams." Once again, she felt as if she had no choice but to believe him as she gave in to the nagging lethargy and let herself slip into the darkness of sleep. What she would tell them the next day about the information stolen by Sabin and Pandora would send Dee and Shaden to the edge of despair. After they had explained that they had been watching her for the better part of a year and revealed their true nature, the morning had taken a sudden spin into doubt and disbelief. Nico's mind reeled as she contemplated the story told to her by her rescuers. She had wondered if she hadn't been saved from one group of lunatics, only to fall into the hands of two other equally deranged individuals. But gradually, as their story unfolded, she was forced to confront a truth she had long buried far away from the light of her better judgment. Hadn't she always known about the Ravens? Hadn't it originally been the presence of the birds which had alerted her to the nature of the vortex. How had she allowed herself to forget the very thing which had been the first indication of the true nature of the anomaly? She had let herself become enveloped in the cold world of corporate politics and high-paying research, only to forget the very thing which had set her down this path in the first place. All these things became stunningly clear as Dee and Shaden explained to her how they had come to seek her out. For the most part, what they had said to her months ago in the bar had been truth. They had been two regular people who had come to Mossborough for the opportunity to see the area where the vortex had occurred. However, they had in all actuality been drawn to the vortex by a deep awakening of spiritual consciousness more than just idle curiosity. They too had noticed the presence of the ravens, and by seemingly unremarkable circumstances had met and began a discussion of their mutual fascination. That had been when the strange dreams which had originally brought them together took an ominous turn. Dark scenes from a distant past life began to haunt their every unconscious moment with visions of an obliterated and starkly mutated world. Full recollection had been a long and agonizing process which had left them both unbalanced with crumbling, intermingling identities. By the end of their first year together, all they had been in this life seemed a thin, false veil that was quickly slipping away to reveal the wounds and scars beneath. Although they were only strangers when they first met, they had been forced to cling to and rely on each other through the excruciating awakening that threatened to destroy their sanities. And there, through it all, had been the Raven. After a day of talking and explaining, it had been Nico who had asked them to reveal themselves, in part to establish the reality of their claims, and also to satisfy the curiosity which had gnawed at her emotions constantly. Shaden had sat at her side, folding her hand and arms as if preparing to hold her down should she prepare to run away. Dee had stood from the dinner table in the light of the melted tall white candles and smiling removed the goggles from his eyes. After witnessing the horrors of the 4 invaders, the sight of Dee's huge, shining black eyes were shocking, but less than terrifying. It had only been as the jet black strands of hair on his head began to fan out, and thin jutting spears of feather erupted from his skin that Nico clutched Shay's hand with her own. She watched as his teeth lengthened and molded together with the skin of his lips as a long, dark beak slowly ejected from his jaws. By the time the transformation was complete, a man-bird hybrid, reminiscent of some Egyptian deity, stood before her with a tall, hunched human body, talon-like transfigured hands, and the head of a giant raven which still spoke in Dee's voice despite the lack of an effective mouth with which to enunciate. "Can you do that too?" Nico had asked Shaden. "No, but I can talk to the ravens. That's how we knew you were in trouble. The ravens have been watching me." She once more realized her own deluded blindness and felt as if until now she'd stumbled through her life. The ravens had been everywhere, outside her house, in the trees uptown, and in the woods as she drove home. They had been there silently watching, and she had somehow managed to ignore them completely. "In my past life, I could talk to cats. I can still, a little bit, but nothing like I remember from before." "What can Dee do?" Nico said, watching as Dee's transformation slowly reversed. "You mean besides turning into a giant bird?" "A few things. But we can talk more about us later, Nico. Right now, it is very important that we try to understand what is going on. What was so important about those files?" For a moment, She watched the small, box-like television on the corner of the kitchen counter where a sitcom about a pretty ghost girl who haunted her old apartment was forced to coexist with the 3 men who had moved in after her death. She had waited all day for some news of her disappearance or the killings at her house, but there had been none. Yamashita had buried the entire event. Nico took a long drink from the glass of wine sitting before her as she collected her thoughts. There is a lot going on in Mossborough that Yamashita does not want anyone to know about. One of the most important things is a discovery that was made several months ago. The company had been using a large field within the compound for the testing of ghost light properties, and completely by accident, they stumbled across a phenomenon which we've been studying non-stop ever since its appearance. While shining a ghost light over open space in the field, it began to reveal the outline of a wall that could only be seen in the illumination of the projector. We set up a series of ghost lights in a grid and eventually found that at certain times an object could be seen phasing in and out of view. "What was it?" Dee said, now having returned to his normal form and placed the goggles back over his strange eyes. "A house," Nico answered. "An enormous house that at times is seen only in the radiance of the ghost light." "That's impossible," Shay gasped, her hand closing, grasping hers so tight that it was now painful. "This cannot be." Dee's voice was low and nervous as he laid his hands flat upon the table. "With everything that's happened, how can you find this so strange?" Nico asked as she studied their shocked faces draining of all color. "You do not understand, Frau Arata. This house should not be visible by any means. It should not exist here." "What does this mean?" "Look, we theorized that because the house was so close to the epicenter of the vortex that it left some kind of particle imprint discernible by the scanners. Honey, it wasn't close to the vortex. It went through the vortex." Shay's hands were now shaking. She nervously clasped them together. "That's not possible." Nico looked from Shay to Dee, but he was staring at the wall, lost in thought. "But isn't it?" he said, as he took a long drink and studied the crystal glass. "What do we really know of what became of the house? We always assumed that it went through and was submerged in the lake. But what if that was not entirely true?" "Stop right now!" Nico's voice was rising with the first traces of anger. "What the hell do you know about the house? And how could it have passed through the vortex?" "The thing that destroyed the world you glimpsed through the vortex was trapped inside that house." Shaden was now looking at the distant Dee as he stood from the table and began pacing the kitchen. "What thing? What was it?" "It's hard to explain," Dee said as he held his hand over his mouth as if holding back a cough. "You have to understand that our memories of this other world and our past lives are far from perfect. Think of your own childhood memories and how distorted and unclear they can be. The same is true of our other incarnations. We remember certain scenes and events, but much of the sequencing and the facts are only loosely stitched conjecture. The events leading up to the destruction of that lost world were in a lifetime before the lifetime previous to this one. 3 lifetimes ago," Shaden said bluntly to clarify Dee's statement. "Yes, thank you, my neighbor. I can remember a whirl of nightmares and horrors which seemed to originate with the house. There was an entity like the Raven, but much more destructive, which was bound there and transported between some shadow world and back again to the destroyed Earth. Look, if this house existed in more than one reality and was somehow affected by the vortex, then it could theoretically exist as a kind of pivot inside the anomaly. The vortex alters the way that matter and energy function. That's how ghosts become capable of affecting solid matter to a greater degree while influenced by the energy. We theorized that the house was, in essence, a kind of apparitional object. "This has to end, Nico," Shaden said, and Nico heard fear for the first time in her voice. "Yamashita cannot mess with that house. You researchers may not have realized it, but you have completely lost control of this project. There are spirits now inside the vortex, which are learning how to use the energy to their own advantage. The people who were in your house were members of a cult. They call themselves Distortionists. They are serving the ghost of that doctor that the police killed." "Neil Kenny," Nico said as she remembered the news story. "Can you imagine the ghost of someone like that learning how to manipulate ghost light for their own advantage? There is another world out there somewhere where you've been dumping these ghosts, and who knows what the side effects of that will be." Nico stared at the blonde woman with amazement. "I don't understand," Nico said, glancing back and forth between the two of them. "Come with me," Dee said, as he moved to the far side of the kitchen and opened the creaking oak door to reveal a staircase. He flipped a light switch, and they began walking down the steps. As Nico followed, she held to the railing which ran down the wall for fear the ancient boards beneath her would give away at any moment. The cellar had been turned into a makeshift computer lab, which Dee passed without a glance as he led her to the far side. There was another door, which one would expect to lead to an old pantry, but instead was revealed as empty except for a simple wooden chair and a ghost light projector sitting on the table in the corner. "In another world that is parallel to this one, there is a house like this one, and a room just such as this in the basement. At scheduled times, we can turn on our ghost light in synchronization with our allies. There, when they activate theirs." He reached behind the ghost light and withdrew a large sketch pad with pages covered in writing and diagrams. "Since we cannot communicate verbally, we write our messages and read them from each other's papers. Our friends have missed the past 3 scheduled meetings, and we fear that something very bad may have occurred. Now, the question is, Frau Rothe, if you will help us." "I will if I can. I just don't see how." Nico just then realized that Shaden was standing behind her. "During our last encounter, they told us that they had come into contact with an individual who might be able to access the Yamashita mainframe here from their world. We need to pass along the information that we have acquired through the Yamashita system. Can you do that?" Shaden waited patiently for Nico's response. "I think I can, but it would be very dangerous. I would have to plant a hidden file in the system and hope that it isn't detected. If you can do this, then you need to try. The Raven wants you with us, Nico." Shaden placed her hand on Nico's shoulder. "The Raven called to you years ago, and you ignored it. Will you join with it now and become like you?" Her pulse was racing as her thoughts traveled in a blur of questions and doubts. "Yes, and become like us," Dee said solemnly. She contemplated the ramifications and realized that there was no rational way to comprehend the end result of such an agreement. She would have to follow her intuition, just as she had so long ago, before turning away for the sake of solidity and security. "Yes, I accept." As the words left her lips, she felt a warm tingle in her shoulder originating from Shaden's hand, from which energy began flowing and buzzing as if she stood in the wake of a lightning strike. She felt abandoned to the power, which now spread through every pore and fiber in her body as the changes began. Chapter 17. The Journal of Clayton Merceaux. November 30th, 2049. Clay, you have to come back. My sister's voice echoing through the myriad of images in which I had been embedded. They're coming, the voice said with urgency as I felt myself being pulled back through the walls of the dark sphere and back into the network of light and over the grid of cyberspace. The sensation was reminiscent of the accounts given by those with near-death experiences, describing being returned to their body. However, my body still lay in unknown hands, and I was returning instead to the indigo-lit dominion of the vortex. I was back in the house, sitting in front of the computer. It took several moments for me to become accustomed to the ever-present filter of bluish-purple light, which filled all space, as if flooding in through the windows from some violet sun. There was movement in the other room, and quickly I stood and desperately looked for some sign of my sister. I glanced back at the desk and jumped with shock when I saw the large black bird gazing at me from atop the monitor. Without a word, it took flight through a hallway, and I followed it at a run as the sound of the shuffling and movement erupted from the living room. The raven landed on top of a washing machine in the back of a utility room by a door leading outside. As I turned the knob, I glanced over my shoulder just in time to get a full view of the thing which pursued me. The thing was a composite of human parts sewn together in a twisted and horrid fashion as to resemble a human spider. The creature's torso had an additional 4 abnormally lengthened limbs attached to its sides, which carried it as it stalked down the hall towards me and held me in the sight of 8 human eyes implanted onto its head within pits cracked into the surface of its skull. It suddenly burst forth at an incredible speed, and I snapped from my paralysis as the raven squawked and flew out. I followed, closing the door behind me. I ran across the backyard as I heard the slam of the door being thrown open. From the corner of my eyes, I could see more forms descending upon me as I tried in desperation to keep up with the raven, but I knew I could not hope to outrun the creatures, which were now a mob of naked, broken, grafted bodies coming at me from all directions. Just as they were about all to fall upon me, I suddenly saw a blinding flash of light and heard an eerie ringing sound, which soon transformed into a beep. "We've got a pulse," I heard a male voice say in the darkness. "I think he's going to stabilize." I longed to open my eyes, but my lids were heavy weights of skin which refused to obey the command of my brain. "I think we've got him," a female voice replied over the sound of sirens, what I could only assume was a heart monitor. It had to have been some kind of nerve toxin, the woman was saying to my left. It had to have been manufactured. Who the hell has something like that? Let the cops figure it out. He's a data pirate if I've ever seen one. They must have pissed off the wrong client. Whatever they used, it was adrenaline resistant like nothing I've ever seen. He was either going to die or go into a coma for a very long time. My struggle to maintain consciousness failed, as once more I slipped down into the ebony depths of sleep. I wondered what had become of Angelica. awakened in a state of mental devastation. My brain was a sluggish, slow-moving system of fuzzy images seemingly incapable of anything but the most simplistic of functions. I was tired and thirsty. My body was limp and weak from inactivity. My head hurt so bad I could have wept. When I last opened my eyes to the blinding light that filled the room around me, I felt sick, dizzy, nauseous. As I tried to focus my vision and get some kind of bearing on my surroundings, an IV ran into the crook of my elbow, and I then realized I was in a hospital. I tried to move, but my arm would not obey the command sent by my brain. The room was a plain white utilitarian example of standard government-provided healthcare, little more than storage space for the sick and injured, without television or chairs for visitors. A few feet to my side was another bed, where a patient lay unconscious and hooked to the same machinery as myself. I saw the buzzer, which I could use to call for a nurse, but I could not bring myself to lift my hand and press the button. All there was for me to do now was to wait and hope that I was conscious enough to ask questions when someone finally came in to check on me. It seemed that I remained conscious for the better part of an hour, spent staring at the white bricks of the wall, wishing the curtains to the small window were open. Finally, I gave up and drifted back to sleep. I dreamed that I was sitting on a park bench on a beautiful day with an old man sitting at my side. His style of dress put me in mind of photos from the early 20th century, and he appeared to be throwing breadcrumbs on the ground. Normally, I would not have expected to see pigeons gathered to feed on the tossed pieces, but instead, there was a flock of ravens gathered all around us. They squawked as they pecked along the ground like ebony hens and fanned their wings from where they were perched in groups in nearby trees. The man was very tall and slender, with piercing dark eyes and a thin mustache over a pale-lipped, slightly smiling mouth. His hair had once been midnight black, but now was almost completely white, with only a few remains of the original dark strands mixed in. His hands were exceedingly long and delicate as he carefully pulled away the bread from a baked loaf and let it fall to the hungry black ravens. "I am glad to see you join me," he said with a thick Slavic accent. "Where am I?" I asked, as I studied my body to find it covered in the clothes of the same time period as the man. "In a dream? No more than that," he answered, smiling. "Another dream. That is all I need." "Who are you?" I asked as I gazed up at the clear blue summer sky and marveled at the deep green of the surrounding trees and grass. "My name is Dragoslav, but you may call me Drago." His voice was calm and patient, as if he were pleased to have company. "I come here every day to feed the birds," he said offhandedly as he gestured to the gathered flock. "If this is a dream, why am I dreaming of you?" I asked, seeing no reason to dance around the obvious. "In essence, my young friend, I feel that this is a message left to you by someone which your brain is trying to decipher unconsciously." "You'd think I'd be used to that by now," I replied as I stretched back onto the bench and felt the warm breeze blow through my hair. Drago laughed and glanced up at the hundreds of gathered ravens which occupied every available branch of the park's trees. "Yes, indeed. It would seem that dreams have become quite a commodity for you, young sir. I don't want to be rude, but exactly who are you?" "I am an inventor by profession, but I work as engineer, physicist, and mathematician as well." "That's one hell of a resume. You ever invent anything good?" He stared off toward the distant lake where people were walking together in groups enjoying the beauty of the park as if unaware of the occupying avian horde. I suppose I could have done better had I been more practical in the application of my work, but some might say I have had my head on the clouds. When I was much younger man, I was most interested in the various forms of energy and transmission, but my ideas were a bit extravagant for the time. I wanted to power cities, and investors wanted a telegraph. He laughed out loud, and I understood the self-deprecating nature of his comment. I believe that a particular area of my research might interest you, he said, now looking back at me with deep-set, piercing dark eyes, in which for a moment I thought I might have glimpsed a slight glow of violet. What area of research was that? I felt a slight chill, despite the warmth of the sun. Just recently, I have stumbled across a new energy type, which was previously undiscovered. The qualities of this energy have proved to be most fascinating. Unfortunately, I fear that I am being watched by those who would like to acquire my discoveries. I believe that I have stumbled across a means by which one can distort time and space, but I have the feeling that I am nearing the end of my time here and will not be able to complete my work. My fear is that my notes will fall into the wrong hands at my death. You see, I have just come to a point in this research where I realized that although this energy is very much a part of this reality, it may be completely foreign elsewhere. The effects of this energy, if misused in another reality, may be quite harmful. I have been experimenting with the effects of this indigo light on the spirits of the dead. So, this is the ghost world, I interrupted. Whatever do you mean? He asked curiously. There are spirits present in your everyday existence. They are visible to you. Of course. Are they not to you? I'm sorry for interrupting. Please continue. This energy seems capable of not only altering the state of existing apparitions, but also opening gateways between alternate realities. Should this technology fall into the wrong hands, it would be devastating. The fools who control the societies of the world should never have possession of a tool such as this. The damage that could be wrought by one malicious person with the ability to use this power could be horrifying. I believe that there is a particular group which is currently monitoring my progress. I was visited a week ago by a strange man who showed a degree of interest in my new research which I found most disconcerting. He showed an understanding of my work which should have been impossible without actually having seen my experiments or read my notes. He claimed that he was a representative for a possible foreign investor who was willing to fund my research in this particular field. I agreed to think about his offer, but I now believe that I must destroy every trace of research before I can fall into the wrong hands. A man. Do you remember the name of those whom he represented? No, he did not give any details, and I was anxious to see him leave. There are those who have said that I can be a bit paranoid, but I could swear that I am being watched. I know the feeling well. Can you remember anything else about him? He was of medium height, with a fair complexion. His hair was dark, and his eyes were hazel or green. He spoke in an odd manner, and I felt with little doubt that he was hiding a great many secrets. He gave his name as Arthur Turley, but I sensed that this was a lie. This is all I know to tell you. I must go now and begin the destruction of my work. The old man, having finished passing out the last of the bread, now stood, and I shook his aged hand. A pained and irritated expression passed over his sharp features as our hands touched, as he seemed to be forcing himself to make physical contact. "It was a pleasure to have met you, sir," I said, as he began to walk away. "The pleasure was all mine. It does me much good to have spoken with someone about this subject. Such secrets can be a very heavy burden on one of my years." "One more thing, sir," I called out before he had gotten out of earshot. "Yes," he answered over his shoulder. "What year is this?" "It is currently January of 1943, he answered amusedly as he continued his walk towards the road. I stood for a moment trying to assimilate everything he had said into my knowledge of the situation with which I was involved. But before I could come to any revelation, the sky had begun to darken. I looked up in expectation of seeing storm clouds covering the bright globe of the sun, but instead bore witness to a quickening nightfall like nothing natural I had ever seen. A shadow was swallowing the world around me, in a wall of darkness approaching, which devoured the green of my surroundings and buried everything in sight within a blanket of ebony. Before I could respond, I was enveloped in a cloud of impenetrable night. "Mr. Marcells, Mr. Clayton Marcells, are you awake?" The voice was soft, feminine, and distinctly accented as my eyes began to peel slowly open. A small Asian doctor stood beside my bedside, gently touching my arm. I looked around and soon realized my surroundings had changed once again. "Where am I?" I croaked from a throat which felt as if it had not been wetted with liquids for an eternity. "I know this may seem quite confusing," she said as she shined a penlight into my eyes and glanced at the readouts on the laptop which sat on the table by the bed. "You have been in a coma. You were first admitted to a state hospital, but when they realized you were a Yamashita employee, you were immediately flown here to Loving Care Yamashita Health in Baltimore. You should be quite grateful. You could have died in St. Louis." "St. Louis? I was in Georgia," I said as I surveyed the room, which resembled the luxurious surroundings of a high-end hotel. "Now, I need you to remain calm and listen to me very carefully." As she spoke, she stepped back and I realized that I was currently strapped down to the hospital bed by my arms and legs and across the chest by padded restraints. What's going on? Why am I tied down?" I said as a dread rushed through my chest and the pulse rate bar quickened on the computer readout. "You must understand that this is a typical procedure in a case such as yours, Mr. Marcells. You have been having problems with your cybernetic implant, correct?" "Yes, of course I have. But what does you have suffered a psychotic episode induced by a small hemorrhage that has started at the base of your neural implant. You were found running from the scene of a reported robbery in St. Louis and were tranquilized by the police. You fell into a coma, and you have been unconscious for weeks. In all likelihood, you had been hallucinating for months. Have you been suffering from headaches and nausea?" "Yeah, all the time, but your implant has been outdated for years now. But I have good news for you. Medical technicians at Yamashita have perfected a removal method for replacing neural implants. Gifted individuals such as you no longer will have to succumb to a fate of mental derangement and loss of perceptual faculties. We can remove the outdated hardware and replace it with a new design which possesses none of the old side effects. I stared at her in wonder and fought with the raw wave of paranoia which was surging in my mind. All my worst fears were being substantiated. I was crazy. I had been hallucinating the entire time. My life really was in shambles. But it had all been so real. I began to weep, but could not wipe the tears from my face. The doctor carefully dabbed my eyes with a tissue and gazed at me with serene compassion. I realized that this is all very difficult for you. Your brainwaves have been hyperactive ever since we began monitoring you. You have been dreaming constantly since you arrived, and probably for the entire extent of your coma. We have stabilized your condition, and you should be free of headaches and dementia until we can perform the surgery tomorrow. I assure you that everything is going to be okay. You are in good hands. Can I remove these restraints, Mr. Marcellus? Yes. I believe you. Thank you, Doctor. Okawa, Denise Okawa. I am the surgeon who will be performing the operation. I will have the nurse undo the straps and bring you some food. Just try to relax and enjoy your stay. Think of it as a little vacation, and when you are done, you will have your life back. There is a television in a bathroom. You will need help with most physical activities. Your body has atrophied from lack of use, and you will need a regimen of physical therapy after the surgery. Patting my hand sympathetically, she left the room and spoke with a nurse at the door. They removed the straps, and I was brought a tray of meatloaf, rice, and vegetables with a glass of orange juice. The soft, tasteless food was still delicious, even though I felt somewhat full after only a few bites. As time passed, and I switched on the large 3D television, I began to feel safe and relieved for the first time in years. Someone was going to help me. All the nightmares and the horrors I had witnessed were false impressions caused by a misfiring brain. I did not have to die alone and insane. I could start a new life and become a better person. I had been given a second chance. That night, I lay in bed and watched the sun sink into a soft orange-red twilight outside over the vast field beside the hospital. I had begun to drift off into a peaceful sleep, but was fighting against the urge in fear of more dreams. I hated dreams. I hated false realities and visions. I just wanted to stay awake and lucid within the confines of the material world where I was now present. I was contemplating telling the doctor that I did not even want a new neural implant. I would live out the rest of my life as a normal, functioning human being with a regular job. Maybe I would actually just become a repairman. As these comforting thoughts began to lull me closer to the brink of sleep, I was suddenly made aware that the monitor of the laptop beside my bed was flashing a violet light which filled the room. No, I said to myself as my eyes widened with panic. This can't happen, I said as I stared at the screen, which was now a blank field of purple. I watched in terror as large white letters began to emerge from the cursor blinking on the screen. Clayton. This is a trap. The sentence seared my brain like a laser knife cutting into my cerebral cortex. You are not crazy, and you have not been hallucinating. What happened is real, and they are trying to trick you. You will not survive the surgery. Go away, I whispered as I clutched my hands to each side of my head and tried to make the dream end. You have got to get out of the hospital. Leave me alone, I screamed, and in moments, a nurse rushed into the room. I watched as the screen blipped and switched back to the status monitor. Mr. Marcellus, are you all right? The young man Scrubs asked as he studied my heart rate and blood pressure on the screen. I think I'm hallucinating again, I said, shaking his hysterical voice. It's okay. Just stay calm. We knew this might happen. We can give you a sedative and another dose of antipsychotics. You're going to be fine. The nurse's brown eyes were filled with sympathy as he grasped my trembling hands. Thank you. I can't go back. It will kill me, I said with tears blurring my vision. It's a good sign that you realize that you are hallucinating. Just relax and remember that we are all your friends and we will take care of you, all right? The man's smile was warm and compassionate as I hugged him out of the depths of my misery. He carefully pried me away and laid me back down as he began to adjust the IV. I'm truly sorry, I said, as I breathed deeply and wiped away the snot from my nose. I feel ridiculous. You shouldn't, Mr. Marcells. We've had a lot of people in your line of work come through here. The older implants never should have made it out of the lab. We've seen people come in raging alcoholics and drug addicts on the verge of complete mental derangement, then leave with a whole new lease on life. You might even have abilities you never even knew about. What do you mean? How long have you had your implant? Since your late teens, he asked, expertly redirecting the conversation as he offered me a drink from the small juice box. Yeah, I answered as I sipped from the tiny straw. We've found that the implants act as a kind of a blocker for many kinds of normal brain activity. It seems like a lot of people who received the implants were often gifted in ways that never developed properly after the procedure. Gifted? Like how? Oh, you name it. We've seen Wynars like you leave the hospital with advanced mathematical reasoning, newfound artistic gifts, even philosophical reasoning. It's almost as if you were forced to sacrifice some latent ability in order to navigate cyberspace spatially. I just want to be normal. Oh, well, normal is a subjective state. But at least we can get rid of the psychoses and headaches. I thanked him again as he left, and soon the sedative was taking effect as I fell into a deep, wonderful, dreamless slumber. The next morning I awakened and sat up in bed to watch morning television. I was starving, but I was not allowed to eat within 10 hours of my surgery. I was told that a nurse would soon begin to shave my head and prep me for the procedure. I stared from within a drugged and contented state of mind at the morning news report. There was an attractive middle-aged blonde woman sitting at the anchor desk speaking with a Welsh accent which indicated the news report was international. As she spoke, images accompanied the reports behind her in fast clips of floods, city streets in West India. Quickly, the scenes changed from tragedy and into a reel of updates concerning the Christmas season, which was soon arriving. I realized non-responsively that I had been in a coma through Thanksgiving. The holidays had meant nothing since my sister's death. Before, I had showed up at her dinners distracted and bored by the candlelight and awesome food. I remembered how she had always played Christmas music on her house system throughout the day, driven us crazy with ancient board games like Monopoly and Trivial Pursuit. I could still see her sitting by the fireplace, surrounded by her army of friends as she read the question from a small, faded card. Who was the rock star who, after recovering from a coma, gave up a lifetime of drug addiction and became the guru of new age drug rehabilitation? Kurt Cobain, I answered. I had just seen the old bastard playing a reunion concert with his band in October. Correct, she answered, giggling. You used to wear a Nirvana t-shirt everywhere you went until you were in your mid-20s, so that one wasn't really fair. That's all right. I'll get you, you data freak. They all laughed when she said that. She was always the life of the party. Now, sitting in the hospital bed, I wished I could go back and relive every single one of those holidays. I wished I could go back and wrap my arms around her and kiss her cheek while she wrestled away. I just wanted to tell her I was sorry for being a distant shit for all those years. I wanted to tell her that she was wonderful and beautiful and the most special person I would ever meet. "I'm so sorry," I whispered to the air, and wished for the first time that maybe her ghost was there to hear. In my hallucinations, I had created a world where ghosts were everywhere. And from a psychiatrist's standpoint, that had been a complete wish fulfillment fantasy on my own part. I had somehow managed to conjure some grand delusion where she hadn't killed herself and was still out there watching over me with some crazy bird deity as a patron. I had created cool friends and a beautiful girl who seemed to like me. I was truly pathetic in so many ways. It was indescribable. But what about that last dream? What about that old man from the 40s who had seemed so troubled and real? Dragoslav, he had said was his name. Where the hell had I summoned him from in my unconscious? Maybe the grandpa I never had. Leaving a computer in a room alone with a cyber mage is akin to leaving a vial of morphine with a recovering heroin addict. I managed to lift myself to the side of the bed and move the laptop table over to me. In a moment, I had opened the web browser and began searching. Starting with the simple basics, I searched the name Dragoslav, but found, as I had anticipated, nothing but endless Slavic names and families. Next, I entered a search from prominent events occurring in January of 1943. Immediately, one event caught my attention. On January 7th, 1943, Nikola Tesla died in his apartment at the New Yorker Hotel. I quickly began to read a biographical essay on his life and career and was struck with the similarities to the old man in my dream. I told myself that this meant nothing, as I easily could have been made familiar with Tesla at some earlier point in my life and dredged up the information for the sake of my delusions. Strangely, however, I was aware that Dragoslav was a Serbian name, and Nikola Tesla was himself born of Serbian parents. Despite my reluctance to indulge my fantasies, a concept took hold. Dragoslav had, according to my dream, been a part of the alternate history of the ghost world. What if, in fact, he was the ghost world parallel alternate of Nikola Tesla, and the information had been left encoded by Nico Arata in my unconscious absorption of her datasphere? If that were true, then it would indicate that someone had been in pursuit of ghost-like technology long before the first initial appearance of the vortex in the alternate reality of Ghost World. For a moment it seemed a shame that the Savannah group had been a hallucination, as this would have been very useful information for them in uncovering the Yamashita mystery. Quickly I closed the browser and nearly slapped myself for indulging my paranoid delusions, now in the wake of a full recovery. Would this madness never end? I was already knee-deep into another psychotic fantasy on the morning of my surgery. I could not let myself fall into this trap set by my malfunctioning mind. Yes, there was indeed a trap being set, but it was by my own mental deterioration. If I allowed this to continue, I would soon be plodding away to escape the hospital, where I was finally going to be set free from the burden of the outdated implant. I contemplated calling the nursing staff and reporting the bizarre turn of my thoughts had taken, but the shame of once more revealing the obvious instability of my mental state halted my hand from pressing the button. Resolving myself to attempt to reason my way out of delusion, I lay back down and focused my attention on the news. Today, another grisly murder in Miami, where police speculate that a group of copycat serial killers mimicking the actions of the now executed Neil Kenny is continuing on the rise. This, on the tail of 3 ghost light suicides in the Midwest, has only added to the speculation that a growing cult of ghost light obsessed fanatics is at work. The FBI have currently initiated a ghost light task force in order to investigate rumors that the crimes are connected to a disturbing website where fans of the late serial killer are involved in file-sharing communications. The ghost light snuff film phenomenon, as it is known on the street, is cited by activists as another example of the complete decay of moral and ethical regulation brought on by a worldwide dependence and addiction to technology. Now, here's Myron Glass with the sports. No, this was the last thing I needed. Not now, when I was just getting a grasp on reality. I had to accept that I was incorporating these events into my psychoses as a means to substantiate my own version of the truth. I turned my eyes from the screen and looked out the window once more at the cold winter day. It was then that I knew my breakdown had neared completion. There were ravens perched on the ledge outside, staring in at me from the cold, their dark eyes piercing and gleaming with occasional glimmers of blue-violet light as they studied me with intense scrutiny. It was then that the door to my room opened, and an older female nurse entered, pushing a surgery prep cart. "And how are we going to do today?" she asked with gray blue eyes and dyed red hair, her tone joyful and cheerful as she seemed moving in step with the Christmas music playing in the hallway. "I'm losing my mind," I said with unrepentant sorrow. She suddenly stopped in her tracks and stared with baffled silence at the windows. "My goodness, what are they doing out there, I wonder?" she said as she quickly moved to the window and gazed at the birds. You see them too?" I asked in awe as she tapped the glass only to have one of the ravens peck back with its long dark beak. "How could I not? There must be half a dozen of the little beasts out there. Oh my, they're all over the park." She was now looking over the group on the hedge and eyeing the field outside. "There must be 50 of them out in the trees," she exclaimed. "I've never seen such a thing. Someone must be feeding them or something." She shook her head wistfully, then returned to the cart, which she rolled to the side of my bed, still occasionally glancing at the audience. Still, at last she pulled the curtain to the window closed. "Okay, Mr. She paused and glanced at the chart on the clipboard on her cart. "Mercells. I'm going to give your head a nice clean shave." I watched as she lifted me gently and wrapped me in a sheet before withdrawing a pair of trimmers. As my head was being shaved, my resolve to battle against mounting paranoia was wavering. Was it possible that this entire situation may be another brick in the building wall of my insanity? Was this nurse real? Had she really just confirmed the presence of a multitude of ravens watching outside my window? After she finished with the electric trimmer, she filled a bowl with hot water from the sink and immersed a white cloth in the bowl, placed it on my head. Removing it, she lathered my head in shaving gel and began the process of carefully shaving my scalp clean and smooth. When she had finished, she smiled at her handiwork and gave my cranium a playful tap. "As bare as a baby's bottom," she proclaimed. My hands were trembling at my sides as the process of beginning a plan of escape began to formulate beneath my cold, shaved head. I could not believe how quickly I had fallen into dementia, but I was not acting on a primal fear which was coursing through my body. It was as if my own nervous system had begun to disregard the constant doubting of my rational mind. As the nurse gathered her things and pushed the cart from the room, I leaned forward and glanced into the hall. There were security guards standing outside my door. Of course, why wouldn't there be? I was a flight risk, being prone to manic episodes and whatnot. I stood from the bed and the room began spinning as my weak legs carried me like a newborn colt to the window. I threw open the curtains and gazed at the ravens who still stood lined along the outside. Looking past the initial group, I now bore witness to the sight mentioned by the nurse. An entire flock of the ebony creatures were perched in trees by the field outside. "You've got to help me," I said through the glass to the intense, staring black eyes. The birds seemed to be in some sort of council with each other as they squawked and pecked casually at the glass. I watched as they began to take flight and circle in formation outside the window. Within seconds, others had joined, and before my eyes, a swarm of dark, feathered bodies were clouding the gray winter sky. My mouth hung open with amazement as the edges of the window began to glow faintly with purple lines of light, which soon spread out over the glass. Now, I could feel the cold December wind blowing as the entire window became a rectangle of glowing indigo. Out of my peripheral, I saw the screen of the laptop, now once more glowing violet, as a single word in white letters appeared in giant, bold, capital letters. Jump. I unhooked the IV from my arm clumsily, and blood spilled from the vein as I climbed onto the chair by the portal. Closing my eyes, I leapt to what could only be certain death. What happened next could only be described as a complete disintegration of every molecule in my body, as the very atoms which comprised my physical being were ripped from their fundamental framework and scattered like dust on the wind. For a moment, there was the most serene feeling of weightless, formless non-existence before a somewhat painful and horrible reformation began to occur. I found it amusing that being torn apart could feel so soothing, but being put back together could be so horrible. Slowly, the experience of complete perceptual deprivation was replaced by an influx of temporal influence as the world seemed to reappear around me. Suddenly, there was cold air and the heavy pressure of gravity around me as I opened my eyes and found myself staring at a dirty stone floor. Weak and disoriented, I tried to lift my body, but my muscles were ultimately drained and useless. I began to vomit in violent spasms as consciousness threatened to slip away. I felt warm hands touching my arms as I was lifted up and carried to a soft, musty-smelling surface, which I now perceived as a couch. I opened my eyes and looked around to find the Savannah group gathered in the dim light of the basement, staring at me with what else but shining brass goggles. "He did it," I heard Esther say with shocked admiration. "I told you the man has balls of steel," Christophorus said proudly. "I was beginning to wonder if we lost you, buddy," Teddy said, slapping my shoulder. I never had a doubt. It was Angelica's lovely voice as she approached, and cupping my face in her hands, pressed her lips to mine passionately. "Give the man some time to breathe," Jesse said from behind me. "It's not every day that a guy gets teleported." "We thought that they had you brainwashed," Angelica said with tears in her gleaming green eyes. "They did," I replied, coughing, mindful that she had just kissed me after I had tossed my cookies all over the floor. "So why did you jump?" Jesse asked, leaning over my shoulder. "To be honest, I just decided that if I was really going crazy, I preferred my delusions to their reality." They all began to laugh and cheer as I was besieged by hugs and warm thumps on my shoulders. "Welcome home, Mr. Marcells," Ryan said warmly. "We missed you. And by the way, I'm really into your new look," he laughed as he ran a long hand over my shaven scalp.